been quite a few incidents, not least the drone attacks on those Russian bomber fleets. So let's start with some of that and the potential Russian response. So Sean asks, will Russia go nuclear in response to these recent attacks? And if that were to happen, how would the West respond?
Yeah, it's two questions. One's got a very standard answer and one's got a very different answer, the second part. The standard answer, and this question comes up again and again, people always ask about, would Russia use nuclear weapons? And the answer doesn't change, but people keep asking it, so it deserves to be answered because it obviously is on people's minds. Fair enough. And so, I mean, so the standard answer, and this answer hasn't changed from the beginning of the war, is no, very, very unlikely. Firstly, the Russians have shown no indication, any physical indication of bringing their tactical nuclear weapons forward or bringing any of the preparations together, which we would see because it would take some time. They talk about nuclear issues all the time because they use the sort of nuclear rhetoric to frighten everybody, and that is, has had some effect. But in practical terms, no, there's no preparation that we can detect for any sort of nuclear use. Not only that, there's no real advantage on the battlefield that the Russians could really get, because Ukraine's a very big country. And if they were to try to use a tactical nuclear weapon against Ukrainian forces, they'd have to use several of them. And again, I could go into the technicalities of this if people want to, but effectively they'd have to use something like 5 or 6 Hiroshima-sized bombs to get rid of, to actually destroy one Ukrainian brigade, dispersed as they normally are, one brigade of 5,000 troops and its equipment. So they would have to go in for a nuclear war in a big way. And even then, that would not, it would destroy one Ukrainian brigade or maybe a little bit more. Or they'd have to launch 2 or 3 nuclear weapons at a city or a town as a retaliatory measure. And that brings in the other issue. The taboo against nuclear use is very, very strong since the Second World War. Sometimes somebody's going to break it. I mean, that at some point in human history, that will be broken. I mean, Putin wants to go down in history as a great Russian leader. I'm pretty sure he doesn't want to go down in history as the man who broke the taboo, the first man to use nuclear weapons in an aggressive mode, not even to defend his own country against the final, some sort of final attack. I mean, that's what nuclear weapons do. They provide a final guarantee that if all else fails and your country is under a threat of complete destruction, you might then go nuclear. And Russia's nuclear doctrine is actually all about that. So I think the chances are very, 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 very low. Now, the second part of the question, what would the West do if a nuclear weapon were used? The answer used to be, under the Biden administration, and this answer was never explicitly said by Biden, but David Petraeus, General David Petraeus, is independent. He works for KKR now, but he was director of CIA. He was America's most. I say Britain's because he's in Britain a lot. He was America's most famous general during Afghanistan and Iraq.
Very well.
And he often would speak with the sort of private authority of the White House. He didn't say things that were antithetical to White House thinking. And he said a couple of times when this issue came up in 2023, he said, if the Russians ever used a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, I'd be fairly confident, he said, that the United States would reply with conventional weapons. We would destroy the Black Sea Fleet. We would attack every base from which tactical nuclear weapons had been used. We would take out the strategic air force of Russia that had done it with conventional weapons. The response would be massive and conventional and would really hurt. Now, that's what he said, apparently independently, but obviously consistent with American thinking. So that was then. This is now. Would the Trump administration do that? No. No.
You don't think so? You think they would, if it, they'd respond?
I think they would. Well, it'd be in a terrible mess if a nuclear weapon was used. But I don't believe that Trump would initiate that sort of response because, as everyone who knows him and knows his relationship with Russia, and people like Fiona Hill, the British academic, associated with our Defence Review, who used to work for him. She worked for 3 presidents, including Trump. She's written books about it. And she says, look, he's frightened of Putin. He admires Putin, but he's frightened of him. And Trump is very frightened or very resistant to using American firepower in a strategic way. He might use American firepower against the Houthis, and he might use it against terrorist groups or small groups, where it's a very one-way process. But the idea of using American firepower in another Iraq operation, say, or something like that, or I mean against Iran, which is on the table at the moment, is quite is hard to imagine. And the idea of using American firepower explicitly against Russia is almost completely off the table with Trump.
So that's interesting. And Putin would, of course, know that. Because Putin, the ex-spy, would have calculated, would have worked it out, and perhaps knows that there is a threshold. But it's interesting, isn't it, Michael? Because that threshold, from what Petraeus was saying, even in the event that nuclear weapons are used, the response from the most powerful country on earth under Petraeus or under Biden would not be to go nuclear either, because they know that is a threshold that you just can't couldn't cross.
But if a nuclear weapon were used, you couldn't ignore it. You couldn't say, well, that's unfortunate, and where do we go from here? There would have to be a response. And then the other thing I didn't mention about that is that it's very unlikely that China would stick with Putin if he used a nuclear weapon, because that would go down so badly in the rest of the global south. And India would not stick with Putin. I mean, Putin would lose his most important supporters and backers if he broke this taboo. So it's very, very unlikely that would happen. It's certainly, I could say with 99.99% certainty that in response to, let's say, an attack on the Crimea Bridge, his pride and joy, he would not use nuclear weapons in response. He would want to respond, but not with a nuclear weapon.
We'll come back to the Crimea Bridge, of course, later on. But it occurred to me as you were answering your question, Mike, because it's something that I've asked you since the very beginning of the invasion, and we've talked about it a lot, and you've been very clear in your thinking and reassuring to me in your responses. But nuclear weapons aren't the only weapon of mass destruction. You know that the Russians have been using gas on the front lines to try and flush out Ukrainian trench positions. Is there any suggestion that the Russians could use another kind of weapon that doesn't reach the threshold of nuclear, but it's more than conventional, chemical or biological?
Yes, there is. I mean, the Russians always believe in retaliating against these sorts of big Ukrainian attacks, and their retaliation has, generally speaking, been more bombing, fairly conventional bombing with drones and ballistic missiles. So one would expect them to try to really step that up and have, say, 4 or 5 days of very intensive air attacks and make it very clear that is their response, so the Ukrainians know. And the Ukrainians will have decided that was likely. They'll have already priced that in to their response. But you can't rule out the idea that the Russians might begin to step over other thresholds, say in biological warfare and chemical warfare. I mean, they've used CS gas, which is illegal, interestingly, to use on the battlefield.
Use it in riots.
That's right. You can use it in riots because it can disperse. But used on the battlefield, it can be used in lethal, or is used in lethal concentrations, and has the effect of driving people into the open where they can be shot very easily. So it is actually a banned weapon on the battlefield. But the Russians, there's lots and lots of reports of them using it. They're using a lot of nerve agents. There were accusations they've been using sarin, which I thought were credible before Christmas. But then I tried to track some of them down, and they sounded credible, but then I couldn't find any really strong information.
Well, sarin will be in people's minds from Syria, of course.
That's right, yeah. Lots of sarin was used in Syria. But there's a lot of chlorine elements used, CS gas, but I can't pin down, other than accusations that sarin has been used, I can't pin down any specific instances where it's proved. But yes, and biological weapons, Novichok, of the sort of things we've seen the Russians used in Britain, is not impossible that they might go for their own sort of spectacular with a biological attack on a civilian population somewhere. And that's plausible, and it would be extremely unpleasant.
And it would be another threshold cross, wouldn't it?
It would.
Next question here is from a poster called Never the Question. Thank you for this. And another one that I've asked you many, many times, Michael. What psychological effect do the attacks have on Putin? Put yourself in Vladimir's mind.
Oh, these attacks are believed to annoy him. I was talking to somebody who keeps track on these things, and he said that Putin's disappeared in the last 48 hours. He's just not made any appearances, which is unlike him.
Because last week he was out quite a lot. It was marked how often you saw him popping up doing things.
I was talking to somebody last night who tracks these things, and he said, we haven't seen him for 48 hours. That could be a coincidence. I don't know. Maybe he's got a cold. Who knows? But he does. These do affect him. They really do, because the more audacious they are, the more humiliating it is for Russian defense forces, I mean, Russian air defenses. And of course, he always makes sure, one of the reasons he doesn't come onto TV immediately is because it would look as if the blame was his. And so he always makes sure that the blame is laid on the regional governor or somebody lower down in the air defense control or whatever it might be. And always, you go back to, the Prigozhin attempted coup, which was very serious. I mean, he was very shaken by that. When Prigozhin and the Wagner group began to advance from Rostov on Moscow and were shooting.
Incredible Saturday afternoon that was.
Astonishing. Yeah, were you on then?
I was on it, and then I went home and I was still watching it go along because you didn't know where it was going to end.
No,
did you?
I was on for part of it and then missed the rest of it on air anyway. But but I mean, they were shooting down their own Russian aircraft. It was astonishing. And he went missing. He went missing for days. And when he came back, he looked shaken and so on. But he makes sure to deflect attention from these things, and they're always put down as terrorist acts. Extensive terrorist acts, and we're dealing with it. And interestingly, after the airfield bombs at the weekend on Sunday, they arrested lots of people. They always do that. They always arrest somebody within 24 hours. Oh, we've got the perpetrators. They always say that.
Strung them up.
Somebody gets arrested every time within hours.
What is the narrative as to what went so badly wrong for the Russian security services that allowed this to happen?
Only that it was some ingenious terrorist attacks, and I haven't heard. I may be wrong about this, but so far I haven't heard a really strong account from Russia as to how it happened. The Russian bloggers are circulating what's circulating in the West. These containers where the roof kind of peels back and reveals all these first-person drones. I mean, that's astonishingly clever. And that's going around on the blogosphere in Russia. But I don't think Russian main channels have used that material so far. They've just talked about terrorist attacks on their airfields, as if it's been groups of terrorists as far away as Beliga in Kursk.
Yeah, I mean, and they went all the way across Russia, just incredible.
Yeah, and in Murmansk in the north,
to get there. Because this
Belaya, sorry, I said Belaya. Belaya. The air base is Belaya in Kursk.
Because of course it's a special military operation, so it's not a war. So
exactly, it's not a war. So these can't be acts of war.
It can't be happening right. And so they can't blame the SBU. They can't blame the Ukrainian security services, or can they?
Well, they can. No, that what they say is that the SBU are setting off terrorist groups. They're sending Ukrainian terrorists or Russian terrorists working for Ukraine to commit these acts. So everything that happens in Russia is a terrorist act, even though. We can argue about it, but these are, by most standards, legitimate acts of war against military targets in a state that has invaded its neighbour.
Just on that, because that's interesting, these are legitimate. There's nothing that you could, in terms of international law, whether or not you can strike that deep into aggressor.
No, you can certainly strike deep into an opposing country if you're at war with it. The marginal line is assassinations of individuals. And so if, and again, assassination of a military officer, which has happened, is a bit more questionable. You could argue that that's a terrorist act, but there is a legal precedent for saying, well, there's no other way of getting at that officer, and that officer is intrinsic to the war that they're waging against you. So you have a right, if you take reasonable precautions only to kill that officer or to affect that officer, then that's arguable. But it does get close to the borderline with terrorism. But attacks on individuals are maybe difficult to justify, more difficult, but attacks on bases and facilities are straightforward in legal terms.
Get on with that. Okay, next question here from HJ. Could Ukraine destroy the Kerch Bridge outright, or is it enough to keep targeting it and causing inconvenience after inconvenience for Russia? So I think this is the third time they've targeted the Kerch Bridge. We saw that truck bomb or explosion very early on.
October 22, and then July 23 was a sort of baby drone attack, which is sea drones, which got underneath and damaged it a fair bit. And so this is the third one. Yes, very hard to destroy the bridge in total. It's 12 miles long, so it's the longest bridge in Europe. I'm pretty sure it's the biggest bridge the Russians have ever built, or the longest bridge they've ever built, I think.
I'm going to check.
Oh, yeah. You have to check it out. The figure 12 miles long I think is fairly secure. And I know it's Europe's longest bridge.
I'm trying to work out exactly when when it came into sort of use.
2018, I think.
Okay, so
2018.
So
yeah.
I'm right. It was post them annexing Crimea.
Oh yeah, that was the idea. They annexed Crimea in 2014, or conquered Crimea in 2014, which is illegal, and then built a bridge to Crimea, which is also illegal because it's a bridge that the Ukrainians certainly didn't agree to. There used to be a ferry, the Kerch ferry, when the 2014 seizure of Crimea took place, and I was at Russia then, and we were looking very carefully at the Kerch ferry. We had a really good Russian specialist with us who said, "You look at this ferry," he said, "it can only take about 6 vehicles, 3 times a day."
Completely inadequate for
Yeah, exactly. There's no way they can supply, Crimea as it then stood with the Kerch ferry. And he said, "They'll have to build a bridge." And we said, "Really, Igor? Are you sure?" He said, "Yeah, they'll build a bridge. They will." He was absolutely right.
Right on. Yeah, and you were right. 2018 it came in.
2018, yeah. So it took them 4 years to build it. But it's Putin's pride and joy. All bridges can be repaired, which is why when the Ukrainians have tried to attack it, they try to attack the vulnerable part, which is the part with the arches on it, that's where the bridge can let shipping through underneath. The rest of it is quite low on the water, so you can't get ships underneath because it's easier to build a bridge which is only 20 feet above the water as opposed to 200 feet above. So the vulnerable part is where you see the big arches, and that's each time it's been attacked, that's where it's been attacked. Could you destroy the bridge completely? No, not really, but you could keep on damaging it so that it becomes unviable for the use of military supplies. And this attack, less spectacular than the others because it's against the support, is to try to make the bridge unsafe, to make it vulnerable, structurally vulnerable, mainly so that the Russians can't send heavy train loads of supplies over it. It's not so much, the traffic is one thing, and they like the symbolism of having to have the bridge closed, but it's actually the train line that they're really after, because that's what a lot of stuff goes. The train line is next to the road, like two bridges in effect, and what they want to do is to stop the Russians, or make it unsafe for the Russians to send ammunition and supplies on this train line into Crimea, which is a major supply hub, or was, for all of their forces in Zaporizhia.
I suppose the engineering of that is that if you knock out parts of the track, that can be easily replaced by engineers. You
can go back to Bomber Command in the Second World War and ask them, how difficult is it to bomb bridges?
Line, right.
Very.
Okay.
Yeah. First of all, it's difficult to hit them, and secondly, it's difficult to hit them well enough to stop them being repaired.
So I think implicit in the question here from HJ, probably thinking about those Taurus missiles that we've been talking about for the last few weeks, is if they could knock it out. They have lots of missile defence around the bridge, don't they? Probably
huge.
S-400, S-300s,
massive.
to stop from aerial attacks.
Yeah.
Is that why they're going for sort of explosives on the structures? Because if you can get to it by sea, it's an easier way of...
Yeah, exactly. I mean, every time there is an attack, the Russians close that loophole, and so the Ukrainians have to be more careful. So the first attack looked like a truck bomb. I'm still not entirely convinced about that, but it seemed to be based on a truck bomb. The second attack was with sea drones just sailing up to it, basically, under the water. And so the Russians have put a stop to any repetition of that. This third one, somehow they've got charges placed. I don't know how they did it, and we, perhaps we'll find out in the next few months. But they managed to get some charges placed that obviously went off quite remotely, and about a ton of explosives. I don't know how they did that, but we'll see. The Russians will definitely find out how they did it, and they'll block that off as well. So the Ukrainians will have to keep on being inventive. But they could try, as and when they get Taurus missiles, they could try just putting holes in the bridge further along, not at the most vulnerable part, just to make it difficult for everybody. But even then,
5 holes in the thing is going to
it can be repaired. But they could make the bridge a real nuisance for the Russians to keep open. That's what they could do.
And that's part of the tactic, isn't it, of these kind of sabotage attacks, to make it really difficult. I mean, just on the drone attacks and the fact that those drones are brought in by truck, an individual on a podcast that I listen to regularly said that now the Russians are going to have to be checking every single truck that comes in. The logistical nightmare that has been caused by the fact that you can't trust any vehicle that's passing over your borders.
That's right, because there were apparently Russian drivers driving trucks. They didn't know what was in them. They were just told to take this container to some area. And there were wonderful reports, or interesting reports, of one driver who said, I was just told to go to a lay-by and stop there, and somebody would come and meet me. And of course, that tells you this is all part of the black economy. He wasn't told to take it to a depot where the load would be properly recorded and scanned and everything. No. He was taking it to a lay-by where a gentleman would come and meet him. So he presumably didn't care what was in the truck, and he was getting paid for what he was doing. And there's enough of that, of course. There's so much of that going on in Russia and in Ukraine as well, incidentally.
Absolutely.
That what the SBU, the Ukrainian intelligence service, obviously did is that they got enough people into Russia, not difficult, Ukrainian, Russian-speaking Russians who are working for Ukraine, into Russia, doing deals with drivers or making arrangements with false companies to send this fleet of lorries off with all these first-person drones in them. And two of the lorries, we are told, were self-destructed because something went wrong. And the Ukrainians, again, had thought of this. They didn't want the lorries captured as they were. So two lorries self-destructed before they got to the point where they would have opened their roofs and released all these attack drones.
Which again was a remote operation. It folded back and the drones came out. Now, when I saw you, it must have been Monday after the attacks, you said that this is the most extraordinary bit of sort of espionage sabotage since the pager attack by the Israelis on Hezbollah.
That's right. I mean, last September, last year, wasn't it? Around the third week of September, I think it was the Mossad attacks on Hezbollah. I mean, giving them a series of setting up companies that supplied them with pagers.
Which must have been over years again.
Oh, yeah, several years in the making. And they'd been supplying them with perfectly good pagers until they started supplying them with ones that blew up in their hand. And then they sent the message. And those pagers were specially designed because they got out of production from the Taiwanese company that produced them. They were specially designed that you needed both hands to actually answer. So you couldn't just pick it up and answer. You had to use both hands, because two buttons on it, so that you were holding it in both hands to pick it up in front of your face to your ear, and then it exploded and blew people's hands off or killed them or whatever. And the idea was that only Hezbollah people would have these pagers because it was what Hezbollah was using, it was what Hezbollah had given people. So the Israelis, in a sense, could say this is absolutely legitimate, although there were some other casualties, some children.
Well, because people,
exactly, and other people were involved. But they had a reasonable case for saying we created a system whereby only our enemies, our expressed enemies, would be affected by these pagers because they were for them only and they would blow up only in their hands. And with one or two exceptions, that was true.
It's the ingenuity of it as well.
Sheer ingenuity, And that, in the writings on intelligence successes in years to come, the Hezbollah pagers and Ukraine's drone lorries, whatever they get called, will go down as two of the big intelligent coups of modern times.
It does make me think of the other ones. And prior to that, there was an assassination on a Iranian nuclear scientist, and I think the Israelis used a sentry gun, a remote-controlled machine gun, or that was certainly the reporting.
That's right, I can't remember his name now, but that was going back to the 1990s, I think it was.
Quite a while ago.
Check him out,
Quite a while ago, but it was, again, this sort of ingenuity of the security forces to be able to do this sort of stuff. Now, Rick White has got a question here on these drones. The Ukrainians declared about 40 aircraft were destroyed by drone, but the footage showed only a handful of aircraft hit. Rick asks, how accurate is the Ukrainian number?
Well, insofar as it can be verified, bits of it are accurate. We don't know about the rest. So the Belaya airfield in Kursk, which is the Siberia one, that's been overflown now by a couple of companies. Maxar Technologies have overflown it with one of their satellites and taken photographs. And this Capella Space have overflown it with synthetic aperture radars, which also can see through cloud and so on, because basically it's a radar beam that bounces off the ground and shows you shapes in great detail. And both those companies, separately, independent companies, have shown that at least 8 aircraft are destroyed at that airbase, which is what the Ukrainians said. So it looks as if some of their Tu-22s and their Tu-95s, that's the Bear and the Blackjack bombers, which are the ones the Ukrainians were really after, they seem to have got a group of those bombers. They also confirmed at a different base, I think at a different base, that they got one of the A-50s, which is the AWACS aircraft, the airborne
control aircraft.
Exactly. Now, and they've had one of those before. They might even have got 2 of them, and the Ukrainians have caught one of them before last year. Actually shot it down, or arranged for it to be shot down, even by Russian systems. And the Russians have only got about 7 or 8 of those operational. So it looks as if they've lost about half of their AWACS force.
Yeah.
And they're very, very valuable because that's the sort of control centre. It's an aircraft that flies, near to the battlefield and controls everything going on.
Yeah.
They're very, very expensive. We run them as well. And, you don't have 20 or 30 of them. You have a dozen or so, or in our case, you have 2 or 3. And you look after them. So
impacts on their ability to be able to control
it will do, the
battlefield.
So what the Ukrainians are saying is we have destroyed, they said, 34% of Russia's strategic bomber force.
Yeah.
Now, that is not verified, but what we've seen so far links into what they have claimed at the Belaya base.
So the Ukrainians say 41.
41,
aircraft done 34%. So the Institute for War Studies, who I know, of course, we listen to, who've got excellent detail on all of this. They're quoting Colonel Yuri Inhat, who said that 10 out of 12 of Russia's 19 Tu-160 bombers and 36 of the 57 Tu-95 bombers were operational prior to the strike, and obviously a number now have been destroyed as a result. As a result of this,
they didn't get so many of the blackjacks of the 160s. That's the biggest. It's a huge supersonic bomber. It's the biggest supersonic bomber in the world. And in a way, the Ukrainians aren't as bothered about the 160s because they're not being used so much to launch cruise missiles against Ukraine in these nightly attacks. It's the old Bears and Blackjacks, these old Cold War bombers that sort of lumber around with the radar signature of an elephant, and they launch cruise missiles from a long way out. And the Russians are keeping their backfires away from the war most of the time because they figure they might need those for another war sometime later.
And it is interesting to me as well, Michael, because I think last week or the week before we talked about striking airfields, and I joked that that you part the planes wing to wing if they're far enough away that they feel like they're going to be safe, and you never do that close to the front line. And where are these planes parked when you see them from the thing?
Yeah, and do you know the Bear and the Blackjack bombers? The Ukrainians don't have any of them, except they have one Bear and one Blackjack bomber in their aviation museum, and they use those two to work out the areas where they had to hit them with the drones.
Really?
Because obviously, if a drone hits at the tip of a wing or something, it's not going to do a lot of damage. But they use their two museum pieces to work out where are the fuel tanks, where are the control systems centered, where do you need this little drone to hit the bomber to do the maximum amount of damage. And so they worked on their two museum pieces as the algorithm for their bombing attack. Yeah.
An algorithm's right, because this is all AI as well, isn't it?
All AI.
Once they were off and running, it was controlled by the computer, which is just a fantastic step forward in warfare. All right, let's move on to another question here. Sean the Prawn, great name, asks, is the Russian summer offensive underway?
Yes, it looks like a rolling offensive, as we thought it might be. It doesn't, at the moment, look like some sort of big strategic thrust with lots of armour in the front to try to, open up Ukrainian lines. I mean, that is still possible, but I think we'd see that building before it struck, and we're not seeing it at the moment. But we are seeing the feeding in of different units all the way around the front. So we're seeing something in Sumy up in the north, and Sumy and Kharkiv is being bombed again last night. There's a lot of air activity around Kharkiv, which is the second city, and we're also seeing more pushes down in the south, where we spend most of our time looking at this, around Chasiv, Kostiantynivka, and Pokrovsk. And the big operation, and we had a great graphic for it last week, and we never got to use it. Is that the big operation is that the roads? I mean, there aren't that many roads in that area. I mean, not like very major motorways, but the road between Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka is a key road, because it also, the other side of Kostiantynivka goes to Chasiv Yar, and if and they're fighting over that road. If the Russians get control of that road, then they can push north to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and if they get particularly Kramatorsk, but even then Slavyansk after that, then they've got the Donbass.
Right.
Then the game's up for the Ukrainians in the Donbass.
For that part.
Yeah. And the key thing is this road. It's like a T-junction. If they get the road, then they cut northwards off the road, and then they're very close then to getting Kramatorsk and Slavyansk.
Have we got insight as to what the fighting is actually like in that part? Are the Ukrainians dug into positions? Are they holding back in towns, and they're sort of keeping their...
It's fairly dynamic. The Ukrainians are launching lots of counterattacks, and they're succeeding in some of them, but they're grabbing back little bits of territory.
So
but otherwise...
punch back.
Exactly. Right, that's it's punch and counterpunch. But the Russians are moving forward, but very, very slowly, because they're working with dismounted infantry now. They've learned if they send in their armoured vehicles first, they lose them, and if they send in troops inside armoured cars, they lose them. So what they're doing is they're sending in small groups of troops who are dispensable, and these are the ones they don't care about, and they send them in little squads of 8s and 10s to grab a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And when they think that that they've got enough of it, then they send in their professional troops in their armoured vehicles when these small groups, what's left of them, have taken most of the fight.
And these troops will go in, they'll grab a property at somewhere it's a defensible position to hold.
Yeah, and they'll take a local position. They're not digging in trenches as they go. They're taking buildings, areas, very often, because this is quite industrial, that area of Ukraine. So there's quite a lot of old plants, old bits of the mines, old bits of the steelworks and mills and things like that. And they, of course, they can be made into fortresses.
I was going to say, fighting positions must be really, really
exactly. If you get hold of one, then you make it into a fortress and move forward. But equally, if you're defending, you can make that into a fortress and fend off lots of attacks, which is why the Russians are still losing over 1,000 men a day. And funny enough, the CSIS in Washington, Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is a very respectable organization, they just produced a report which came out, I think, yesterday. And their view is that the whole war has now cost about 1.4 million military casualties. And they said it's just on the million now for Russia, and it's 400,000 for Ukraine, and that's killed and wounded.
Right.
And that's the point. I mean, the Ukrainians look as if they've lost about 40% of what the Russians have lost, but the Russians have lost just on a million, dead and seriously wounded. And that's only going to go up.
Well, there's a question here from our viewers who are watching us. Thank you for this one, B. Hunt, who asks, at current rates of attrition, is Russia likely to run out of soldiers and equipment?
Not run out, no, because it's recruiting people from all over the world, because it's paying them, large amounts of money. So their own soldiers from the east are being paid a lot to go. There are not many soldiers from Moscow and Petersburg or Western Russia, proportionately, but lots from the east and lots from foreign countries. Also, they've got lots of foreign workers from Africa and Asia working in their arms factories, and they've imported them as labour, and they're paying them pretty well. And so, literally, Russia's arms production is being driven now by an influx of foreign workers. So they can keep on going. They'll keep on doing it. I mean, Russia's a big economy. And it's a big war machine, but as I keep saying, it's like a sponge. You can sort of punch into it, but it keeps resuming its shape. But equally, the sponge itself finds it difficult to create a big offensive. It just keeps sort of spreading out and spreading out. And it's very hard, therefore, for the Ukrainians to stop it unless they have a lot more modern equipment and, I have to say, some different tactics all the way down through their whole system. But the Russians can keep going, but it will strain their economy. It's bent their economy out of shape already.
Yeah.
But it will strain their economy more and more from next year, which is one reason why I think Putin is going for as much as he can this year. Now, if he is interested in doing a deal at some point, a ceasefire, it'll be towards the end of the year when he's got Donbass and he can say, this is now my territory. And now I'll agree to a ceasefire, and that will give him the break he needs before he comes back for another go in 2-3 years' time.
So Putin said on the 13th of May that Russia is recruiting 60,000 volunteers to join the armed forces every single month. I mean, my maths is terrible. I can't work out what the attrition rate is, but whether or not that is enough for them.
No, they are. They are. I mean, they're losing on average. The average is now 1,300 a day. They're now recruiting more than that. So they're recruiting 1,500 to 2,000 a day, which is just 60,000 a month. And so they are doing that. I mean, people are sort of not clear about, or disagree on this. Can the Russians keep on doing this just by recruiting foreign individuals and individuals in the East to their army? Or will at some point the Russians have to go in for mobilization again? Right. I mean, Putin went in for partial mobilization in late 22. 300,000. It was very unpopular. It wasn't called mobilization, called partial mobilization. Very unpopular, and things were pretty shaky for the Russian government as a result of that. They're desperate to avoid that. But if they keep bringing in, foreign nationals to their army, and their army's the quality is going down and down and down, until they can recruit Russians who want to fight really want to fight and are prepared to train properly and be given the time to train, this army is not going to be very good. It'll be big, but it just won't be good. And the quality is going down all the time of the mass of the army, but they'll keep on adding to that mass as long as they keep on paying for it.
The other thing that we've talked about as well is that people do get paid, don't they? Families, if you die in battle, get a huge payout, which for
That's right,
many people who are from the poor parts of Russia, changes their family life once the person dies.
That's right.
Markedly.
There's all sorts of anecdotal reports of neighbours saying, "Oh, look at so and so. She's riding round in the car that her dead husband bought for her." Because that's it. To be able to afford a car, to have a house for the son-in-law or for the daughter and the son-in-law, all those sort of things are unaffordable for a lot of Russians, east of Moscow, and paying for or getting paid for father going off to war is quite an attractive prospect.
It's 19 million rubles. I've just looked on here. I think it works out perhaps to $68,000 for a deceased.
That's right, and I think average pay is about $13,000-$15,000, and so you're talking.
So they're making good money if they go and do it.
You get a signing on bonus, which is like 3 or 4 times the average pay as a straight lump sum, and then you get much higher pay. It varies from region to region, and of course the average does as well, but much higher pay. And then the family gets big payments if you die. And also you get lots of veterans benefits. So if you survive, then you're given all sorts of privileges as a veteran for the rest of your life, and you and your family. So it is a sort of an attractive package for people who are relatively poor and are prepared to take the risk.
All right, let's move on to this next one. It's from CD, or could. Will Ukraine attack the Kremlin? It seems like they could very easily, or at least put the fear that they can. And of course they did. It's reported attack back in May 2023.
That's right. There was a drone attack then, though Ukraine never claimed it. And my sense of it was always that I don't think those drones came from inside Ukraine. I think they were launched by somebody else closer to the Kremlin. Maybe
still by the Ukrainians, though.
Possibly.
Quite
Russian possibly Ukraine or a Russian opposition group or a group that Ukraine was prepared to sponsor. I mean, we never really got to the bottom of that. But it didn't do any good, and it plays to Putin's narrative that Ukraine is involved in a war to destroy Russia, that the West is trying to destroy Russia, and it's using Ukraine as the sort of battering ram to do it. So I don't think there's much to be gained politically from attacks on the Kremlin. And the Ukrainians have got to stick to the idea that they are attacking into Russia, and they're sticking to military targets that make a difference to them, things that will ease the pressure on them. So aircraft that can launch glide bombs, fuel centres that are sending fuel to the front line, railway lines and logistics. Things that matter to the front line in Ukraine is what they need to show they're attacking.
Well, similarly, the point that you made that if Russia were to use nuclear weapons, they would lose support from India and China. If Ukraine were to start hitting targets like the Kremlin, they would lose whatever little support they have in the unaligned nations. They'd lose
that, yeah. And the danger, I said this at the time, that they're playing with fire if they do attack something like the centre of Moscow like that, because although they'd say, well, these were only Ukrainian weapons, that distinction will be lost. Were they Western supplied weapons or Ukrainian weapons? Nobody will care too much. So the Ukrainians have got to be careful, and they do play with fire sometimes when they do these things. And one of the things they have tried to do with their attacks toward Moscow, not on the Kremlin, is to close the airports. I think there's, 4 airports around Moscow, and they can all be closed pretty quickly by air attack. And that, again, it inconveniences the Russians, and it reminds the Russian people that you may call it terrorism, but this is what war feels like.
Just a couple of weeks back, I think they were being closed every other day.
That's right.
The airports were being knocked out already. The operation was being stopped because of the risk of air attack. All right, let's move on to a question here from Monty, and Monty's asking you a question that I always love to talk to you about, Michael. It's about drone warfare. How has drone warfare affected the other forms of conventional war and tactics that were used at the start of the war? And my favourite statistic about this is that 70% of casualties are now caused by drones. It's completely changed the way that we fight wars.
Yeah, it has. I mean, the thing is, when we say drones, we're talking about robotics as well. So it's, drones in the air, but, drones at sea, drones on land. It's the same sort of thing. It's a robot system of some sort, a robot vehicle, which can either be a surveillance vehicle, an intelligence collection, or a lethal vehicle that can fire a weapon, or it can just be a kamikaze vehicle, which goes to a target and blows itself up. And yes, I mean, this is all. I mean, drones have been around a very long time, and we often say the first really effective drones were the V1 doodlebugs that the Germans fired against London in 1944. And they were, I mean, they'd existed before that as well, but they were the first really effective drones. The whole science of drones didn't move that far forward, and then in 2020. the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia.
Yep. Okay.
And the Azerbaijanis used Turkish Bayraktar drones.
Yep.
That's right, with Israeli Harab drones, little drones, as surveillance. And there was nothing clever about either the Harab drones or the Bayraktar drones. But the Azerbaijanis used lots of them. That was the point. Instead of using just a handful, they used lots of them and found that they were extremely effective against Armenia's Russian tanks. And I remember at the time talking to people in the Ministry of Defence in 2020. I mean, Ben Wallace was a Secretary of State for Defence then, saying we're taking this really seriously. So
really?
we are really looking at this because everybody was sitting up as a result of that.
But the US and UK did use drones in Afghanistan and Iraq. Predator and Reaper
in very
drones.
small numbers.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean, they were terrifying to the population.
They were,
people there because they would fly overhead. You'd see the thing. You'd hear this buzz. The Israelis used them a lot as well in Gaza for surveillance and for
mainly
attacks.
surveillance. And the drones that we developed was the Protector and we had Watchkeeper, which is a surveillance drone, and Predator, and that was a drone which like an aeroplane, fired missiles, so it just did the same as an aeroplane.
Big old things as well.
Anyway, it was the size of a small plane anyway. But what the Turkish drones showed was that really cheap drones used in the hundreds rather than in their handfuls could make a strategic difference, and that understanding in 2020 is what went forward really into the battles of 2022 and 23 in Ukraine. And what we've seen since is an astonishing development of drone and robotic warfare, mainly drones, because that's the way in which robotics can be used most easily in the air. Once you get down to ground robotics on the sea, they're all more complex, more complicated just to move around. But drones, small drones able to deliver one charge, one grenade, but directed with AI, with a computer system to follow somebody, if necessary, into a bunker and drop the grenade into this poor man's lap, in effect. That is something that has developed only in the last 2 or 3 years, and it's pretty fundamental.
And that's some of the wireless ones. They're also being wired now. There's fibre optic drones that they're using on these huge sort of spools of cable.
There'll be an answer to that. We don't know what it is yet, but there will be an answer to these fibre optic drones, some way of breaking the cables or disabling what the cables do. We haven't come up, the world hasn't yet come up with it, but there will be one.
And just a few more numbers on the drone production. Russia's producing 300 drones every 3 days, aiming for 500 drones a day.
Yeah.
It's reported.
Most of them small.
Yeah. Well, they've adapted the Iranian Shahid ones.
Quadcopters.
Yep. And the Ukrainians are going to be making 2.5 million drones a year. Their whole drone industry is huge.
In 2022, realising what drones were doing, I remember Zelensky saying, we will produce 1 million drones next year. 1 million drones, he said, for 2023. And that, of course, well done. But that figure is now, treble it. Treble it now, 2 years later.
And they can churn them out in the day, so it's completely changed everything. All right, move on to some quick fire questions, if we can, Michael. Clock is ticking. Here's one from Stevie T. It's about Sumy again. With 50,000 troops gathered near Sumy, are they a tempting target for Ukrainian fighter jets?
Well, they would be if they came together in big enough groups. But what the Russians have learned, like the Ukrainians, is that if you've got troops ready for an offensive, keep them dispersed. At some point they have to come together, but you only mass them quite late on before you go into a manoeuvre. But yes, anyone who brings large numbers of troops together close enough is making them a target. Just a very quick one on it. In the old days, they used to say, for centuries and centuries of warfare, you didn't know. That's right. You knew where the enemy was, but you didn't know if you could destroy the enemy. Right? But you knew where they were because you could see them, you could hear them. Your scouts came back and said they're over the hill there. But you didn't know if you could destroy them. Now it's the other way around. You know you can destroy them. You just don't know where they are.
Right. They're so dispersed. Here's a question here from Alan999, and Alan, you may be tempting fate here. Why is Trump so quiet? He's going to go on Truth Social immediately, isn't he?
Because he's on the verge of failure in this peace effort, and he's not going to associate himself with failure. Now, he may come through with some rabbit-out-of-the-hat initiative, and that's not impossible. But the more time goes on, the more likely it is that America will walk away from this. And that, we all think he's in the process of walking away. So it's not entirely set in stone yet, but he's quiet because his instinct, I think, is that this is going to fail, so stay away from it.
Right. Sophie Louise has a question about the bridges again. Were the bridge incidents over the weekend in Russia a sign that Ukraine has Taurus missiles?
Almost certainly not. I think they will get Taurus missiles, but I think we'll see them more clearly when we do. The Russians reported that both those bridges were blown up One bridge was blown as a train was going underneath it, and the other was blown as a train was going over the top of it.
Yeah.
And both of them seem to be charges, pre-laid charges. So, classic sabotage operation, I think.
It's a train going to Moscow, 7 killed on it.
That's right. Yeah, it wasn't without casualties.
No. I mean, and again, a terrorizing attack.
It was, yeah. And it was an attack, in Russia. One bridge was in Bryansk and one was in Kursk. Mm-hmm. And the Ukrainians have got they can make a good case to say that was a legitimate target. But yes, civilians were killed, and that is allowable. It's tolerable in international law, depending on how carefully you set up the operation, but almost certainly not tourist missiles. No. But we may see tourist missiles do exactly that sort of thing as and when the Ukrainians get them.
They suggest that the missiles are coming, and then they show, look, this is what we can do without them. Imagine
what
we get.
I think that's quite important for them. Yeah.
Smithy asks, how aware are people in Moscow and St. Petersburg that Ukraine is now hitting Russia regularly?
Well, as we said before, I think they're certainly aware of it. The Russians don't not report these things because they know that there's enough local reporting of what goes on, and the blogosphere in Russia, circulates stuff the way it does in Western countries. So they can't pretend it hasn't happened. But as we were saying, they put it all down to terrorism. And so, what I think the Russian population are told is that they're fighting a war, they're winning a war that they have to win, and one of the consequences is that we are the subject of terrorist attacks, and that's the view, that's the line, and most Russians seem, as far as we can tell, the Levada Center is the only center we've got in Moscow, the Levada Foundation, I think it is, that publishes reports which are reasonably independent. And they seem to indicate that the Russian public, they support the war, they haven't turned against it, and that this is the necessary cost of it.
I wonder if it becomes self-fulfilling as well after all these decades of propaganda telling you that the West is your enemy, and then suddenly you're in a special military operation against this Nazi regime that's been told is across your border, and things are happening to you in Moscow and St. Petersburg. It reinforces the belief that you've been fed.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all think that Russian public opinion is probably quite brittle on this, but of course, they want to see them. They want to see their side win, but increasingly they want to see the war over. Right. They want to see an end to this, and quite a reasonable number. The last time I was looking, well over a third of those polled said that we ought to make concessions to get it finished with. We ought to make concessions to see an end to this.
Well, they should tell the Russian delegation in Istanbul that member had no concessions or maximalist demands. All right, last quick one from Stanthman. Do you think it's a clever idea publishing for all to see, especially the Russians, how you got your drones into their country?
Well, I understand the argument there. That's a sort of judgment which the SBU and Zelensky, the SBU, the Special Intelligence Service, and the President's office will make. Do we get more out of showing the world that we can do this, or keeping the Russians in the dark? The point is that the Russians will work out pretty quickly exactly how it was done. They'll want to do that. So they will find out anyway within a week or two, and so the Ukrainians will want to show the world what they could do. But it does mean that they will find it hard to do it again a second time.
Well, just an addendum to that as well, as you told me yesterday, there's some senior Ukrainians who are in the States at the moment, or at least were in the States while this was happening, to kind of show, look, this is what we can do if you continue.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, Andrei Yarmak is there, who's the chief of staff of Zelensky, and that clearly he's talking to the staffers on the Hill and Congress people to say, look, we're not beaten. We are the victim in this, but we're not dead and buried. I mean, we can carry on, we can fight, we can hurt the Russians. Look at what we can do.
All right, let's move on to the final question. I'm going to wrap two into one here, one that we had sent to us from Joe from before and one that's come in while we've been talking, Michael. And it's about the UK and the Strategic Defence Review. It indicated an increased risk of future conflict, including attacks on the UK potentially. Is it time for the public to start preparing, do you think?
Well, that's a good question, actually, because it's the great unanswered question of the Strategic Defence Review. I mean, the Defence Review is all about what British defence is going to do, and the government's on board for this, and so this is now government policy, and we'll take it forward to NATO. What nobody knows is whether the public will buy this, because what the review has said is that we've got to stop thinking of ourselves now as in a period of prolonged peace. We are already in a certain sort of war with Russia. The Russians are already making war on us up to the threshold with cyber attacks, with attacks on our pipelines, attacks on our cables, and it could get a lot worse. And I think it could get a lot worse in the next 2 or 3 years. We're not at military confrontation yet, but that's where we're heading, and we've got to be prepared for that. We hope to avoid it by deterrence, but to deter it, you've got to be prepared to do it, and the other side's got to see you can do it, that you're capable of it, and that you're prepared to. What we don't know is whether the British public will be on board for that. Right. And we'll find out, I guess, in the next year or two, when the sacrifices that have to be made to implement this defence review in terms of either higher taxes or cuts in expenditure, things we're talking about today with the spending review. I mean, we'll get to see what the real cost of this, the opportunity cost of this review is over the next few months, and then we'll get a sense of whether the public opinion will go along with it.
And of course, we've spent more on defence before, but the economy was different before. The tax burden was not quite as high before.
Exactly.
So it probably didn't feel that bad. You can tell me because you lived through it, Michael. Not to say you're much older than me, but that feeling that we're spending all this on defence and yet our schools don't work and our hospitals are full up, maybe wasn't so acute.
It is problematical, yeah. I mean, in terms of the tax burden, we're about middle of the European scale. We're nowhere near the highest tax population in Europe. We're about middle of the scale. But undoubtedly, people feel that we are taxed to the hilt because we expect much more of government now. I mean, compared to 50 years ago when I was a youngster, government just didn't do certain things, which now everyone assumes it must do.
Yeah.
And so the expectations of government are much higher, and they're expensive. And so we now have, we're in this situation where we now have to take some pretty big decisions. And will we duck the defence requirement? Maybe we will. I don't know. I hope we don't, but maybe we will.
Well, on to our final question then from John Smith, who's put this in as he's been watching along. Thank you for this, John. If Michael Clarke were leading the defence review, what would you prioritise in the budget?
Well, I would, if I were involved with it, I would prioritise the sort of things that are in it. I mean, it's transformational, and that means that you've got to put a lot of effort into the development of AI, digitising the forces, things that won't show up very much. It's not ships, tanks and planes so much, although we do need new generations of those things. But it's laying the foundations of a digital force structure. And what the government is saying, what the review says, which I agree with, is that we want to, and if we can, we want to increase the lethality of our forces by tenfold in a decade. Now, that sounds a big ask. It's not implausible in the modern world. And then we've got to use that new transformed ability to be a small but very effective military power to contribute it to our allies, our European allies, particularly Northern Europe, to take not necessarily the leading role, but to take a leading role, which helps to solidify our defence and our sense of reassurance, particularly in Northern Europe and amongst our big partners, so France, Germany, Italy, to a lesser extent, because Italy's Southern Europe and it's on a different track in some ways, but certainly France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and our North European partners. We are the essence of, I think, of security for this country for the next 60, 70 years. But to get that right, we've got to look after the North Europe, the North Atlantic, and we've got to transform our forces so that they can do these sorts of things with less heavy metal.
I said it with the last question, but I want to put you on the spot, Michael. Sorry about this. What would you cut then in public services to achieve that? Or if not cut in public services, what would you do to raise the money? How would you get there?
Yeah, for me, it's got to be a combination of higher tax and spending cuts. And so you can say, some of the welfare area is probably going to end up being cut. Don't want to see it, but probably would have to do that. Possibly some of the environmental area would be possibly cut. You don't really want to try to sacrifice education, and you certainly want to restrain the growth in spending on health. Because we're doing sort of 60 billion on defence, we're doing over 300 billion on health. And by common consent, although we all love our health service, some of that spending isn't as efficient as it should be. So it's a combination of public expenditure cuts somewhere and higher taxes elsewhere. And you can do a certain amount by extra borrowing. You can borrow, as long as the international community or the financial community thinks you're borrowing responsibly, they won't punish you for doing it. If they think you're borrowing irresponsibly, then you'll get punished by, bond rates will just suddenly go up. It'll cost more to borrow and so on. So you can add an element of extra borrowing if, as the EU countries are now doing, if you can convince the international markets that this is responsible, that you have a growth impact, and that you can still afford to pay the interest on the stuff you borrow. So it's not impossible. You can do some of it like that.
Well, there you go, Chancellor. Michael's answered it all for you ahead of the spending review next week. And on that thing about the borrowing, I think there is a school of thought that's looking at some of these investment banks, aren't there, as well, that go specifically towards defence and rearmament.
Absolutely. I mean, getting some more private capital into putting liquidity into the defence business. And even the services are talking about that. The Army's talking about that.
Yep.
Don't regard defence as somehow an evil necessity. Get into it because it's all part of preserving our freedoms, and it will have a growth impact. It will help as well. That's the argument.
Yeah, Professor Clarke, always great to have your thoughts, your brain. Magnificent. Love the conversation as always. Thank you very much for being with us and submitting all your questions. We will do another one of these next week, schedules being aligned. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your afternoons, and we'll see you again very soon.